Welcome to Guide to the Global Economy. I'm Josh Lipsky, the director of the Geoeconomics Center at the Atlantic Council. On today's episode, we're going to dive into Guatemala's politics and economics and see what's happening there and what it means for the region as well as the entire Western Hemisphere. And then we're going to look at labor strikes in the U.S., the recent Hollywood strike, and how that compares to labor strikes over the past few years during COVID and the pandemic. But first, I want to turn to Ryan Murphy, young global professional with us here at the Atlantic Council. Ryan, last week, everyone in Washington was consumed by what happened to King Gong, China's foreign minister, who was removed from office. But we at the Atlantic Council Geoeconomics Center focus on the economic angle, and there was another China story that wasn't covered as much.
Indeed there was. So we were looking this past week, at IMF World Economic Outlook projections. And so these are quarterly reports published by the IMF that generally predict where a country's GDP, how much expected to grow a year. And what we see is that there's actually no revision to China's forecast. China's forecast has remained at 5.2%. And that's quite surprising given that we see some downward trends in more Chinese fundamentals.
Yeah, it was surprising. And let's see what that looks like in the data. So here you have the revisions or lack thereof. And as you said, many were expecting a downward revision for China's GDP growth in 2023 because we've seen such negative economic news come out, especially the past month. But you don't have it. And I think it's helpful to explain what we're looking at here from the China perspective versus other large economies.
Certainly. So right here we have the number of revisions for each of these major economies. These are 18 major economies that generally comprise much of the G20. Compared to China. And what we see is that China is systemically revised less in a lot of these IMF World Economic Outlook revisions than these other major economies. In fact, it's actually on average about a half point lower.
And here you have no revisions. That's the July 2023, so it's why the IMF held firm at 5.2%. And it's really an interesting question when we think about this because this is a flagship product of the International Monetary Fund, just so people understand. The World Economic Outlook, one of the most important things the IMF produces, countries, finance ministries, central banks around the world look at what the GDP projections are going to be, as does the private sector. And one thing we've seen actually is the private sector forecasts, which were higher than the IMF, seem to be coming more in line with the IMF's forecast.
They do seem to be coming more in line, and they're still about that 5% or slightly over 5% projection. And this is interesting, though, because the private sector has actually had much more volatility in its predictions. So, for instance, JP Morgan, as of this month, has revised China's forecast 6 times. And in general, across the private sector, this has fluctuated with a band of 1.4% in all the total growth projections.
So the IMF has stayed more consistent. The private sector has kind of come back down. But most everyone, is still projecting at least 5% or above for China's GDP in 2023. And the question is that right, and why?
Right, so 5% is a very significant number for China. So generally speaking, the Chinese Communist Party announces at a party congress the targets for that year's GDP growth. And generally speaking,
must be nice to be able to do that.
It's nice to be able to have it. But certainly over the last 20 years or so, we've seen these actually been met constantly year over year. The only times they've been missed has been in 1998 during the East Asian financial crisis, and just barely missed in 2014 and 2015. However,
and last year I think there was a miss as well, but still zero COVID policies.
Last year was a miss, and it was much more significant. So we had a target of 5%. China only grew 3.3%.
Yeah, significant.
Exactly. And so the target this year has been set again at about 5%. And there's expectations that there's a certain credibility to this number, so that Chinese Communist Party will pull out all the stops to make sure that they actually hit this.
Well, that's such a key point because you're saying, well, why doesn't the IMF revise more? You have negative investment cycle news, negative consumption news out of China, manufacturing issues out of China. So why doesn't the revision go down? And one of the answers we came up with in the research is because the IMF and private sector forecasters as well believe China is going to pull out the stops, as you said, to meet the growth targets. There's fiscal stimulus. There's monetary stimulus. If China wants to meet the growth target, they're going to meet the growth target. At least that's what history has largely told us. But is this year the same as past years?
We might not expect it to be the same as past years, and there are several reasons for this. One is that there's a huge amount of local government debt. And so the Chinese Communist Party is very concerned about this exploding. And part of the issue is that when they set a high growth target, many local governments take initiative. They want to meet it. They provide fiscal stimulus. And this might be something that they might not be trying to encourage.
Yeah, that's the question. Is 2023 going to be like all the past years that the forecasters are saying, well, China's going to meet its growth target? It's a psychologically important number, 5%. It's a politically important number, 5%. And we should put this in perspective. You know, this is much lower growth than China was experiencing for almost 20 years. So already it's certainly a slowdown. The question that's going to weigh on the entire global economy is how much of a slowdown. And of course, we have the next IMF report coming out at the annual meetings in Marrakesh in October.
Exactly, and we might expect to see some downward revisions there.
Yeah.
And like you said, this is a huge revision from even pre-COVID 6.5% growth targets. And so again, we might expect to see some of this downward trajectory in a future World Economic Outlook.
I think so too. If we're going to look towards something going forward, look at that October WEO, because then you're close to the end of the year. You know a lot of the economic data that's inputting into GDP, and who knows what will happen, but my expectation is that there you do see a downward revision on China's GDP. Ryan, thanks so much for looking into it for us.
Thank you, Josh.
For Under the Radar this week, our team took a look at Guatemala, what's happening inside their political and economic system. And I want to turn back to Ryan Murphy. Ryan, welcome back. It's August in DC. You were holding down the fort for us here at the Geoeconomics Center, and we appreciate it. So you were looking at China and the World Economic Outlook, and you're also looking at Guatemala. And what piqued our interest in this was recent travel, actually, by Taiwan's president to the U.S.
Exactly. So in March, actually, Taiwan's president came to the U.S., went to Los Angeles, then went to New York. But U.S. was not her final destination.
I didn't realize that.
Yes.
So where did she end up after that?
So she went through the U.S. on a technicality, and the technicality is that she was going on a state visit to Guatemala. So that was actually her very circuitous pastour.
I think the news glossed over this fact because it was all about her visit to Los Angeles. That got a lot of attention, but she was en route to Guatemala. So why Guatemala? What's the relationship between Guatemala and Taiwan?
So Guatemala has recognized Taiwan since 1933, and they've actually maintained that recognition. In fact, they're only one of 13 countries in the world to still have formal diplomatic relations with the island.
That's fascinating. And is this a controversial political topic?
It is a controversial political topic, and we've seen shifts in the region, specifically around this controversy. So just in the past 5 years, many Latin American countries that had prior recognized Taiwan, such as Panama, such as Nicaragua, have actually shifted their recognition. And just a week before Taiwan's president landed in Guatemala, Honduras shifted its recognition.
And this is, I assume, about Chinese economics and lending and opportunities that these countries may have with China and some of the geopolitics involved with strings attached to the money. Is that right?
Much of it is. So Chinese FDI, foreign direct investment to the region, actually has not changed in magnitude, but as it scaled back investments elsewhere, it's changed as a composition of China's investment. So it used to be about 3 to 5% in the kind of mid-2000s, and now it's actually at 10% of all Chinese investments globally.
Is there potential that Guatemala will shift like others in the region?
So that's what the recent election has been about. So in June 20th, we see an election between Torres, who supports Guatemala's recognition of Taiwan, and Arevalo. And now Arevalo is interesting because he's advocated some increased ties with mainland China with the object of gaining more trade, but he's been kind of non-committal on the question of Taiwanese recognition.
And there's an interesting political incident that happened to his campaign, his party.
There is. So the two advanced to a runoff. Neither could secure a majority of the votes. But on July 12th, his offices were actually raided. It was a very Watergate-like moment. There were police outside. And members of the U.S., congressmen, denounced this activity.
So his offices were raided. And what are the political implications in terms of the election?
The political implications is he's gained much more support from the Guatemalan populace. So he's gained...
It's been a backlash.
Exactly. So he's known as an anti-corruption candidate, but even now, larger international organizations, the OAS, has come out kind of in support of an open and fair election. Congresspeople in the U.S. and the Biden administration have also kind of given their support. Yeah. And so very potentially, he could be the winner in the August 20 runoff.
Wow, so this election, it's enormous implications for Guatemalans, for the region, and for really the entire world that's thinking about shift toward China or away in this decoupling diversification, and obviously the U.S. has a deep interest here.
Exactly. And so this is a new pivot on which some of the Taiwanese fortunes in Central America may turn.
Well, thanks for tracking the travel of Taiwan's president, which helped us lead to this story, which is sort of a classic under the radar kind of exploration. So something we'll continue to look at. We'll look at the election closely along with our Latin America Center here at the Atlantic Council. Thanks so much, Ryan.
Thank you, Josh.
For By the Numbers this week, we wanted to look at labor strikes in the U.S. and see what's changed over the past few years, given all the recent news out of Hollywood and across the country. I want to bring in Mugank Broussari, Assistant Director with us here at the Geoeconomic Center. Mugank, what was our big number this week?
200,000.
That's a big number.
That's how many people are striking in the U.S. labor force right now.
Let's see what that looks like.
Yeah.
Okay, so walk us through the chart.
Yes, so we see the 2014 to 19 average being at a fairly high, about 150,000, and since 2020 that number has dropped severely. And this is the reason we're seeing strikes right now at such a high down to 3 reasons. The first is that economic conditions have really worsened since COVID. Yeah. People lost their jobs, a larger share of national income was not going to labor, it was going to capital.
Yeah.
And also inflation has been high for the last year, inequality has increased. So people are feeling a pinch in economic and material terms.
Yeah.
The second reason is that people could not strike. They could not protest and form picket lines in a physical way because of COVID restrictions. You could not have large in-person gatherings. People were hesitant. So for the last 2-3 years, that's not been a real possibility.
So that's what explains the drop down here.
Exactly.
Tough economic conditions, organizing issues during COVID and the pandemic, but something's changed in 2023.
Yes, and the third reason, which is really critical for 2023, is that unions have bargaining power right now. The job market is still tight even though interest rates are high. People feel that they have jobs, they still have opportunities, and they can still bargain for better terms in their relationships with their companies and with capital.
And that's certainly what you see in the Hollywood strike, which is generating a lot of the growth here, because 2023 is close to the 2014-2019 average, actually a little below, but the writer strike, the actor strike, once that gets factored in, you're well above, and that's where the 200,000 plus number comes in.
Yes, and it's 76,000 people alone just in the Hollywood strike, so it's a really large component of what is forming the strikes.
And it could have been an even higher number, as many people know. UPS workers almost went on strike. That was averted through a deal. If that had happened, both the national and global economic ramifications would have been huge, but they struck a deal. So no strike, still a very high number. When we think about this, though, historically, and we look back a little, yes, this is high for 2023, and you outlined the reasons why this dropped so significantly in 2020 through 2022. But American workers' unionization stats over the long term have really declined.
Yes, Josh. In 1980, 1 in 5 workers in the U.S. economy was part of a union, and today that's just 1 in 10. So 10%. So it's been since 1980, it's been a continuous downward decline in union membership. But at the same time, unions have the highest approval ratings they've had in 50 years today. But the membership
that's interesting. I didn't realize the approval ratings were so high. So the question is it a labor resurgence? Is it not? We have to look at it in the context of the past 5 years, but also in the broader context of the past several decades. And that's where it's a murkier picture, I think.
And it is also not a US-only picture, Josh. This is something we're also seeing across the world. Because, for example, I actually just came back from holiday, and my transit was in London. And a cancelled flight, a delayed flight, and lost baggage
you lived through the ramifications of a strike.
There are strikes happening elsewhere too.
Yes.
And people are really around the world feeling the pinch in the same way that they lost their economic well-being to some degree. They could not strike for a few years. And now
it's such an interesting insight you have at the UK, because we know a lot of labor action in the UK, and you just experienced it firsthand. And of course, their economic conditions are far worse than the US. The US is enjoying relatively strong GDP growth compared to what many think. We may avoid a recession here in the US. Labor market is tight. UK, not like that. Inflation still very high, but also still having a high labor movement situation, which implies there is something going on maybe post-COVID structurally in labor movements.
There's also a lot of stress in the labor markets, just in terms of people are really frustrated of the last 2-3 years that they've not have had the economic opportunities. They've not only seen, especially in the UK, where they've seen an actual decline in their living standards to some degree. And so there's some pent-up frustrations that we are seeing now.
And that can spill over, of course. Final thing on the Hollywood strike, because there's a way to look at this and say, oh, well, that's unique to the industry in terms of how studios work and streaming works and writers work and actors work. And I think some of that's true, but some of it also applies to other big companies and the way they use technology in their businesses. It's something we'll look at very closely here and carefully track. Gonk, thanks so much for looking into it for us.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks for joining Guide to the Global Economy. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We're going on a brief August recess for the guide, but we have a slew of interesting stories coming out in the fall on China's economy, on Russia's economy, and everything happening in international politics and economics. So stick with us. We wish everyone a restful summer.